Hello everybody and welcome to Parks Bros. It's Drew here. And as many of you know, I was able to visit Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio this past summer, America's roller coaster, and what many would consider the best park for roller coasters in the world. Now, it was my first visit. I got to spend a good 4.5 or 5 days at the park, and I was able to ride 15 of the 17 roller coasters on this legendary peninsula. But this is a brand new series that I'm starting called Ranked, Rated, and Reviewed, where I will limit myself to 1 minute of reviewing, giving a rating, and then ranking it in the park. But let's get this list started very quickly with my number 17, Wilderness Run, an Intamin kiddie coaster that was actually Intamin's first coaster ever. I did not get to experience this coaster because I was more preoccupied with riding some of the bigger and badder rides at the park. But also, since this is a kiddie coaster, it is not really meant for me at all. But it is the shortest and slowest of the two kiddie coasters in the park, so just for that, I will put it at my number 17 spot. And this definitely could be your first coaster ever, and there should be no problem with that. Now, moving on to my number 16, this is Woodstock Express, the second kiddie coaster on the list and at the park. This is another one of those coasters I did not get to experience, but it is the taller and faster of those two kiddie credits. So for that reason alone, I have put it above Wilderness Run. But next time I go to Cedar Point, I will definitely make sure to try and check these two little kiddie coasters out. But again, this coaster could be probably your first ever, and definitely seems to be a ride that anyone could enjoy. But now let's get into our timed portion, because I've ridden every coaster that is included on the list going forward. But this leads to number 15, Wicked Twister. Now, I know this is going to be very controversial because I know a lot of people that love Wicked Twister. This is an Intamin impulse coaster, but with my one ride on it in the 4th row, I know not the best choice, it was not very great in my eyes. It was kind of disappointing, a little jostly, not too exciting or intense, and those twisted spikes didn't really offer anything besides a little bit of headbanging, actually. So for that reason alone, it is actually my least favorite coaster at the park. I just found it kind of boring and not too crazy, in all honesty, at least in row 4. Now, of course, when I go back, I want to try it near the back of the train, but as of right now, kind of with Wicked Twister, and overall I would rate it a 4 out of 10, and definitely make sure you're at least an intermediate rider. This definitely should not be your first coaster, but it's not the most insane thing at the park. Now, moving on to number 14, this might not come as much of a surprise though, and this is Corkscrew, the Aero inverting coaster. And this is generally thought of to be the worst coaster at the park. Now, in all honesty, I always have a soft spot for Aero roller coasters, and I actually quite enjoyed Corkscrew, I'm not going to lie to you. But the roughness did get to me, and a little bit of just the induced and inflicted pain on my neck as well as the rest of my body did take away from the experience a little bit. But I did enjoy the airtime hill as well as the hang time on the corkscrews. But besides that, everything was just kind of shaky and not really great. And for that reason, I gotta give this a 4 out of 10 as well, and definitely a blue square, meaning that I would definitely recommend being an intermediate rider and this not being your first coaster. But it wouldn't be a terrible choice for your first looping coaster. Moving on to number 13, this might actually come up a little bit of a surprise, and this is the Cedar Creek Mine Ride. This is the family mine coaster at the park that is actually quite scenic and has some really fun, enjoyable elements. It's a little janky, a little weird, but you do got to remember this coaster is now 50 years old as of this season, but I really enjoyed my couple rides on it. It's not crazy or intense at all, but it's an enjoyable family coaster and is definitely a ride that could be your first coaster or second coaster for sure. But do be warned, it is not the smoothest thing in the world. It definitely can rattle you around a bit, but I still thought it was a fine family coaster. And for that reason, I gotta give it a 5 out of 10 overall. And this is definitely a beginner coaster. This could be your first, and it wouldn't be a bad choice to be either. Now, moving on to number 12, this is another Aero coaster. That's the 3rd one in the row, and this is Iron Dragon. Now, Iron Dragon is honestly very bipolar depending on where you sit. Near the front, it's more of a relaxing ride, not too crazy, but near the back, you do get a little bit of intensity. I actually enjoyed this coaster more than I was expecting. I've always heard the worst about Iron Dragon, how it's the worst suspended coaster ever. Now, out of the two I've been on, it's my least favorite. But that is not a knock at all, especially in that second half. If you're in the back half of the train, you will definitely experience some really cool, intense elements. Not to mention its really scenic properties. But Iron Dragon, another great family coaster, I would say. I'm going to give this a rating of a 6 out of 10 overall, and you should be towards an intermediate rider, but if you're sitting towards the front of the train, I could definitely say a beginner rider wouldn't be a bad fit for this ride. Now, moving on to number 11, we have the Parks wooden coaster, only wooden coaster now, by the way, and that is Blue Streak. I actually really enjoyed my rides on Blue Streak. It gave some nice pops of floater and even a little bit of ejector airtime, and it definitely gave that classic coaster feeling that PTC Woodies are known for. This was actually my first Philadelphia Toboggan Company coaster, and I quite enjoyed it. It was a little janky, but still really enjoyable, and honestly, I would say a great introduction to airtime. It's not too intense to scare anybody off, and it's definitely a great family ride. But I would give Blue Streak a 7 out of 10 overall, and I would definitely say it's for intermediate riders. Now, moving on to my number 10, this actually might be a little bit of a surprise for some. This is Fowl Raven, the B&M dive coaster that is actually highly controversial. A lot of people seem to hate this ride, and it being my first B&M dive coaster, I actually quite enjoyed it. I think it's a very solid coaster, and I do actually have a full review that I will link in the iCard up at the top right, but I really thought it was enjoyable. The first drop was awesome, some of the inversions were great, especially with some awesome hang time. My only real issue was the pacing as well as the restraints. But besides that, it's a super solid coaster and really enjoyable. But I would have to give it a 7 out of 10, which is honestly a great score, and definitely be an experienced coaster rider by this point, especially for its very tall heights as well as its crazy inversions and more intense elements. Now, another controversial opinion I have at number 9 is Raptor, the B&M inverted coaster. I really enjoyed my rides on this coaster in the back row, but it wasn't as insane as I was hoping. The first half definitely was a standout for me. Loved the first drop as well as the first inversion, and not to mention the Cobra roll. Oh my goodness, it flings you. But I felt like the second half just kind of meandered and was almost Silver Bullet 1.0, which is not a bad thing. It's just not exactly what I would like to see out of an inverted coaster. But if you would like to see a full in-depth review on Raptor, let me know. I will see if I can do it. And just to let you know, for any of these coasters, let me know if you'd like to see a full review, because I'm sure I'd love to talk a good half hour about any of the coasters on this list. But anyways, moving on to that score, it is a 7 out of 10 for me, and you should definitely be an experienced coaster rider to have some insane moments on Raptor. Now, here is going to be probably the most controversial opinion of this entire list, and this is number 8 with Top Thrill Dragster. I know. Now, Top Thrill Dragster is the second tallest coaster in the world, as well as the third fastest in the world. It hits 120 miles an hour and goes 420 feet in the air. On paper, it is insane, but also on paper, you'll see that it's only 17 seconds long. Now, 17 seconds is actually more than enough time, I would say, to make an amazing impression, and honestly, it did, but I only got one ride on it, sadly, so I didn't get the entire experience that I would have liked to have. But this first launch is one of my favorites of all time. It just feels like it keeps going and is never ending. And the view from the top of the top hat is just crazy. I wish you could stay up there all day before spiraling down back to earth with some awesome laterals. But I do think if I was to get some more rides on Top Thrill Dragster, it could potentially be a little higher in my list. But for right now, it ranks at number 8 with an 8 out of 10 overall. And you should definitely be an experienced coaster rider for Top Thrill Dragster. Now moving on to number 7 in my list, this is Rougarou, the B&M floorless coaster that was previously Mantis, which was a stand-up coaster. But man, I got a couple rides on Rougarou in the back row. It is the smoothest floorless coaster I have experienced, at least in the back row. And it was super enjoyable, and the layout was probably the best part of the ride. The layout is phenomenal. And it also has some of the best lateral forces as well as just whippy turns that I've ever experienced on a B&M. But Rougarou really was a standout to me that I did not expect. And as of right now, it is actually my favorite floorless coaster. But out of 10, I would give it an 8, and I would definitely say be an experienced coaster rider before riding Rougarou with its many inversions. Now at number 6, I would consider this to be one of the most underrated coasters of all time, and this is Gemini, a dueling aero mine train on steroids. Gemini gives some amazing airtime, head choppers, and of course it duels with another train, which adds so much to a ride. But Gemini really holds a special place in my heart, and if it ever gets announced to be closing, I am going to Cedar Point within the month to go get as many rides as possible on this thing. And while it's not the most insane thing at the park, it is one of the most fun experiences at the park overall, especially if you end up racing your friends. It's just so much fun. And of course, you can't forget Money Train. But overall, I would give this an 8 out of 10, and I would definitely say this is in between being an intermediate rider and an experienced coaster rider. There are some really intense moments of airtime on the ride, but this, I could definitely say, would be one of the first bigger coasters to endure. Now at number 5, I have my second favorite B&M of all time, and this is Gatekeeper. This is my first B&M wing coaster, and I really enjoyed all my rides. I have a full review on this coaster as well, but the layout is super graceful and even forceful, not to mention the amazing near-miss elements during the ride. Gatekeeper really blew me away, and I thought it was amazing. Out of every ride at Cedar Point, I rode Gatekeeper the most, and it's a really re-rideable, really fun coaster that makes you feel like you're flying. And for that reason, I gotta give it a 9 out of 10, and you should definitely be an experienced rider for this, just for its extreme height, as well as some crazy inversions. All right, now we're getting to the top 4, which is really where this park stands above a lot of others. And at number 4, Magnum XL 200 takes that spot prominently, with some of the most insane moments on a coaster I have ever experienced. Now, this coaster was built by Aero in 1989 as the first hyper coaster. That means a coaster over 200 feet. And the first half of this ride is just fun and fast, and it's not really anything crazy. It actually is a little janky. And if you remember me saying Gemini is a mine train on steroids, Magnum is just on a whole other level. But the first half isn't anything insane. You might get a good pop of airtime, as well as amazing views of Lake Erie, but then the second half just flings you. It wants to kill you. There are multiple triangle bent airtime hills in a row, and if you are sitting in the first car, you are going to be flung. Now, it's not even just the first car, but I would definitely say if you're near the front of the train, it is one of the most intense experiences I have ever had on a roller coaster. Just looking at pictures of me on the ride, you can see how much I'm getting flung out of my seat. And I'm sure if there was not a restraint, I don't know if I'd be here telling the tale. It is crazy, but for that reason, I gotta give it a 9 out of 10, just because the roughness takes a little bit away from that experience, especially in the first half. So it's not perfect, but it's still crazy. And I would definitely say you have to be a very experienced rider to enjoy Magnum XL 200. It's one of the most intense coasters I have ever ridden. Now, moving on to number 3, we have the world's first Giga coaster built by Intamin in 2000, and this is Millennium Force. Probably my favorite coaster at the park, at least in my heart. For some reason, I have latched onto this coaster, and if there was only one coaster I could ride for the rest of my life, it would probably be Millennium Force. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the awesome speed, the gracefulness, the forces, and the airtime. But this ride just makes you feel like you're soaring. It is so unbelievably enjoyable. And of course, I have a full review on Millennium Force, but man, it is just so enjoyable to me. And I cannot wait to go back just for a couple rides on Millie. And if you've seen my review, you know I rank this a 10 out of 10 and say you should definitely be an experienced rider just because it is over 300 feet tall, as well as it reaches 90 plus miles an hour. But anyways, moving on to my second highest ranked coaster at the park. This is where the showdown happens in Frontier Town. And at number 2, I've put Maverick. The Intamin Blitz coaster opened in 2007, and I would say this is one of the most intense coasters I have ever ridden, up there with the likes of X2 as well as the RMC Raptor models. And it also features one of my favorite elements of all time. That final Stangle dive is just insane in the right seat. But I have a full review of this coaster as well, and Maverick just blew me away. I thought it was fantastic. The moment I got off this coaster the first time, I was muttering, is this my favorite coaster of all time? Is this my number 1? Now, I will have a top 25 list coming out very, very soon, but man, Maverick is just another beast. And I would put this as a 10 out of 10 easily, and you definitely should be a heavily experienced coaster rider before embarking on a ride on Maverick. But speaking of a whole nother beast, this leads into number 1, and this is Steel Vengeance, the RMC Hyper Hybrid coaster. When it opened, it was the tallest, fastest, and longest hybrid coaster in the world, and it has more airtime than any other coaster out there. Now, in all honesty, if Steel Vengeance wasn't as long in duration as it is, I would probably put Maverick and maybe even Millennium Force above it. But because it just keeps going forever with over a half a minute of weightlessness, it's just an experience that you have to go see for yourself. Steel Vengeance is another category of ride for me, and I absolutely loved every ride I had on it. But you can check out my full review as well up in the top right corner. But Steel Vengeance gets a 10 out of 10 for me, and you should definitely be an experienced coaster rider before riding. But there you have it, every single Cedar Point roller coaster ranked, rated, and reviewed. But I hope you enjoyed this new series. I'm very excited to start this up with some other parks as well, especially in SoCal. But Cedar Point, is it the best roller coaster park in the world? Let me know your opinion down in the comments below. I would certainly say it's up there, but I definitely want to go back in the next couple years to experience some of these amazing coasters yet again. But do make sure to subscribe if you have not and you enjoyed this video, because we're going to have tons more like it in the near future, as well as updates and vlogs and reviews galore. But until next time, we'll see you on the next ride.